At a birthday celebration, my father-in-law berated me in front of the family. "Why can't you just keep quiet?" he yelled. I stayed calm, excused myself, and walked out. When I came back, I had hired a private investigator and found something shocking about his past that would change everything. I stepped through the front door, the familiar scent of roast beef and flowers hitting me like a wall. It was supposed to be a celebration, a birthday, a chance for the family to gather. But the moment I crossed the threshold, I could feel the weight of it all, the heavy expectations, the unspoken rules, the judgment that seemed to be baked into the air, thick and suffocating. The family was already in full swing, the conversation humming in the background, punctuated by bursts of laughter and military jargon that I couldn't quite follow. I watched my husband Ryan talking to his cousins in one corner of the room. His smile was wide, his laughter genuine. It made me feel even more out of place, like I was standing on the edge of something I could never quite be a part of. And then I saw him. General Thompson, my father-in-law. His presence was impossible to ignore. Even though he was standing across the room, I could feel his eyes on me. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that demanded respect. I'd learned over the years that it wasn't just his rank that made him so imposing, it was everything about him. His uniform, the medals pinned to his chest, the way his voice carried in the room as if he had the authority to command the air itself. Ryan's family was all military. Every single one of them had served, and those who hadn't were married into the lifestyle. Me. I was the outlier, a civilian. I didn't know the first thing about war or duty or honor, not in the way they understood it. It wasn't that I didn't respect it, but I didn't share that all-encompassing sense of pride they carried with them. I wasn't born into it, and no matter how many years I spent at family gatherings, I was always on the outside. I tried to blend in, smiling at the cousins who talked about their deployments and the challenges they faced, but it was like I was standing on the edge of a conversation I didn't belong in. I nodded along, pretending I understood when they discussed military strategy or the sacrifices they made, but I didn't, and they knew it. They could see it in my eyes. My father-in-law, General Thompson, was the worst of all. He had this way of looking at me like I wasn't quite up to par. The way he tilted his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over me with a quiet judgment that never seemed to end. No matter how many times I tried to fit in, it was like I was still a stranger to him. And every time we were in a room together, the air would change. He didn't have to say anything for me to feel it. His silence was louder than any words could ever be. Tonight, though, it was worse. There was something in the air, a tension that I couldn't shake, like a storm about to break. I kept telling myself it was just my nerves, but the longer I stood there, the more it felt like it wasn't just me. It was everyone in the room, caught in the grip of his gaze. Every conversation felt like a test, every gesture of performance. It didn't matter what you said or did. You were always waiting for the moment when General Thompson would turn his attention on you. And then, just as I thought I could slip by unnoticed, it happened. "Ah, there she is," General Thompson's voice rang out, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. The air shifted, conversations stopped, and eyes turned toward me. I didn't even have to look to know he was staring at me. I could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical thing heavy on my skin. My chest tightened, and my smile faltered for a second, but I forced it back into place. "Ryan's been telling me how well you're doing," he said, his voice booming across the room as if I were on trial. "Must be nice to live a life without the responsibility of duty hanging over your head." I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks. There it was again, the familiar sting, the subtle cutting remark that somehow felt like a public humiliation. He wasn't even trying to hide it. Everyone was watching now, waiting for me to respond. I gave a quick smile, trying to keep my voice even. "It's going well, thank you." But I could see the way his eyes narrowed slightly, As if my answer wasn't enough. As if everything I said was being weighed and found lacking. The tension in the room thickened, and I could feel the collective breath of the family held in anticipation. It wasn't just an innocent question. It was a challenge I could never quite seem to win. Must be nice being able to ignore all the things that matter, he continued, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving mine. You know, we've got a country to defend, a world to protect. There's a reason we wear these uniforms, a reason we fight. But I guess that's lost on some people. His words weren't just insults. They were a reminder that I could never truly understand what he had done, what his family had done. To him, I was nothing more than an outsider, a woman who didn't know the first thing about sacrifice, about what it took to protect the freedoms we enjoyed. And I could feel the weight of that judgment in every word. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out thin. I'm sure you've made incredible sacrifices, General. I have a lot of respect for what you've done. He raised an eyebrow, clearly unsatisfied with my response. Respect's not enough. You have to live it, breathe it. It's not just something you show up for when it's convenient. It's a lifestyle. It's who we are. I knew what he was doing. It wasn't just a conversation, it was a test. A way for him to see how far I would bend, how much I would take. He wanted to see if I would crumble, if I would reveal some weakness. But I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction, not this time. I forced myself to stand a little straighter, to meet his gaze with a calm that was almost fake. I get it, I said, my voice quieter but no less firm. But that's not my life. I can't pretend to understand it the way you do. There was a beat of silence. The whole room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his reaction. For a moment, General Thompson just stared at me, and then without a word he turned his attention elsewhere. The conversation picked up again like nothing had happened, but I could feel it. The tension was still there, thick and suffocating. It wasn't over. I looked around the room, and for the first time in years, I felt completely alone in this family. The birthday party was just a backdrop to the battle that was always simmering beneath the surface. I had been humiliated once again by the one person whose opinion seemed to matter more than anyone else's. And no matter how hard I tried to fit in, I knew I would always be the outsider in his eyes. The weight of his words lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. As soon as General Thompson turned away from me, the room seemed to exhale in unison. Conversations resumed, but the clatter of forks on plates and the buzz of voices felt distant, almost muffled. I could still feel the sting of his words like a slap that reverberated through my chest. I didn't know what was worse, the words themselves or the way everyone in the room seemed to be waiting for me to respond. They were all watching, all expecting me to crumble. But I didn't. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept my face composed. A tight smile, a few polite words here and there, trying to seem like I was in control. But inside, I was unraveling. Ryan hadn't noticed. He was still in his conversation with his cousins, laughing and joking like nothing had happened. I couldn't tell if he truly hadn't seen the way his father had humiliated me, or if he just didn't want to confront it. Either way, it didn't matter. I was alone in this, just as I always was when it came to his family. The hurt, the confusion, the anger, it all bubbled up inside me and I fought to keep it down. I had spent years trying to fit in, to find my place in this rigid military world, and yet, no matter what I did, it was never enough. I was always the outsider, the woman who didn't belong. As the evening wore on, the noise around me grew louder, but the tension in my chest only tightened. I kept looking at Ryan, trying to catch his eye, hoping he'd sense something was wrong, but he was lost in his world, oblivious to the battle I was fighting inside. I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of General Thompson's judgment, the disapproving looks from his cousins, the feeling of being utterly invisible in this family. It was too much. I'm going to step outside for a minute, I murmured to no one in particular, excusing myself from the conversation I had been half engaged in. Nobody paid much attention. They were all too absorbed in their own chatter. I felt a pang of isolation at how little anyone seemed to care. I walked quickly to the back of the house, the sound of my shoes echoing against the hardwood floor. The hallway felt too narrow, too confining, but it was the bathroom I needed, not space. I could feel the tears threatening to spill, and I couldn't allow that to happen. Not in front of them, not in front of him. The bathroom door clicked shut behind me with a soft thud, and I locked it instinctively. I stood there for a moment, my back pressed against the cool door, trying to steady my breathing. My fingers were clenched into fists, nails digging into the palms of my hands. I hadn't even realized how badly I was shaking until I looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked foreign to me. Pale skin, eyes wide and red-rimmed, lips pressed into a thin line, as if I were trying to hold back a flood that was ready to burst. I hadn't cried in front of anyone in years, not in front of Ryan, not in front of his family. I had to be strong, the way they expected me to be. But now the mask was slipping, and I wasn't sure I could hold it up much longer. The tears came then, hot and furious, blurring my reflection. I let out a shaky breath, a sob catching in my throat, and the tears fell freely. I didn't care anymore. Not about the birthday celebration, not about the people in the other room, not about the facade I'd been trying so desperately to maintain. All the anger, the hurt, the humiliation that had been building for years finally broke through, flooding me in waves. I wasn't just crying over tonight. No, this went deeper. It was about the years of walking on eggshells, trying to prove myself to a family that had never accepted me, trying to be someone I wasn't just to earn a sliver of their approval. But no matter how hard I tried, I was always the outsider. I hadn't belonged then, and I didn't belong now. I sank to the floor, my back pressed against the cool tile, the sobs racking my body, sharp and uncontrollable. The anger was there too, bubbling under the surface. Anger at myself for letting him get to me, for letting him make me feel small, for letting this family make me feel invisible. I had spent too long trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine. The thoughts were a blur, a mix of self-loathing and frustration. Why did I even try? Why had I allowed myself to believe that if I just kept my head down, if I just played the part, things would get better, that I would be accepted? But it never happened. Not for me. Not with him. The bitterness washed over me like a cold wave. I could still hear his voice, the sharpness of his words cutting through the room, cutting through me. His disapproval was like a brand, searing my skin, making me feel like I was nothing more than a nuisance. He didn't care about who I was, about what I brought to the family. I was just the woman who didn't belong in his world. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, but the tears kept coming. I couldn't hold them back anymore, not now. I just let them fall, each drop a release. But each one also carried the weight of everything I had been carrying for so long. It was as if my whole life had been a slow burn. Years of walking on eggshells, years of trying to prove myself, years of trying to be something I wasn't, and tonight, General Thompson had struck a match and set it all on fire. I stared at my reflection in the mirror again, my eyes bloodshot, my makeup smeared. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. She was someone I didn't want to be, someone who let herself be torn apart by the expectations of others, someone who had given up so much of herself just to be accepted. But for what? The acceptance would never come, not from him, not from this family. A rush of anger surged through me, hot and fierce enough I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep letting them make me feel less than I was. It was time to stop pretending, time to stop fighting a battle I could never win. I stood up, my legs unsteady as I wiped my eyes, taking a deep breath to steady myself. There was no point in going back to the celebration, no point in pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I was done. For the first time in years, I felt a clarity I hadn't known before. It wasn't about fitting in anymore. It wasn't about earning anyone's approval. It was about standing up for myself. The tears had cleared my mind. I wasn't going to let this family define me. Not anymore. With one last look at my reflection, I straightened my shoulders and walked out of the bathroom. Whatever came next, I would face it with my head held high. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, leaving the noise and laughter of the party far away, I felt the weight of everything crashing down on me. A mixture of anger, betrayal, and a deep, aching sense of isolation swirled inside me. I had finally done it. I had stepped away from my father-in-law's toxicity, but in doing so, I realized just how deep the roots of this family's dysfunction went. How much of my life had I spent pretending? How much of my own identity had I buried beneath their expectations? I wasn't going to let this slide. I wasn't going to let the humiliation and the contempt he had shown me become just another chapter in my life that I could forget. It felt like a betrayal, one I had suffered silently for years. But now, I was determined to expose the truth. If I had learned anything in the past few years, it was that silence only rewarded those who wanted to bury their secrets. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. My mind was already racing with questions, each one more urgent than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to General Thompson's history, a story that had been hidden for far too long, just like the way he had always treated me. There was more to him than the authoritative, polished exterior he wore. I could feel it deep down. I reached for my phone, the cold screen flashing back at me. I'd never thought I'd be making a call like this, but desperation can make you do things you never thought possible. A private investigator. I didn't know how to start or even what to ask, but I knew it was the only way forward. There had to be something buried in his past, something that could expose him, just as he had exposed me last night. I dialed the number I found online. The voice on the other end was smooth but professional, a woman's voice, calm and reassuring, asking how she could help. I gave a quick, tight explanation of what had happened, how my father-in-law had humiliated me at the party, how it wasn't the first time, and how something in my gut told me there was more to this man than anyone knew. After some back and forth about details, the investigator assured me she could look into it. She promised to get back to me within a few days, but I could tell by the way she asked questions that she was already starting to dig. It didn't take long for me to realize that I wasn't the only one curious about General Thompson's past. As the days passed, I began to let my mind wander. What was I really searching for? Was I looking for a way to get back at him for his cruelty, or was I trying to understand the man who had shaped my husband's entire worldview? The man who held so much power over our lives? Both, I realized. But more than that, I was looking for answers. Answers to questions I'd never even had the courage to ask until now. It had always bothered me that people in the family spoke so little about his military career. General Thompson was a hero, after all. Or at least that was the story I had always been fed. Stories of his bravery, his sacrifice for his country, how he had led his men through some of the most difficult times in recent history. But I had overheard snippets of conversations, whispers that didn't quite add up, remarks about an incident that never got talked about, as if there was some kind of unspoken agreement to pretend it never happened. I dismissed those comments at the time, assuming they were just the kind of family gossip I had no place in. But now those whispers felt like clues. The investigator called me back sooner than I expected. Her voice was flat, almost clinical, as she explained that she had started with a few basic queries into his military record. "It's all public information," she assured me, "but there are things that sometimes get overlooked. People forget, or they choose not to dig deeper." The first report she sent me hit like a slap to the face. It wasn't exactly shocking. Nothing about General Thompson's service was a secret after all. But there was something deeply unsettling about seeing it all laid out in black and white. The dates, the assignments, the commendations. But then, just as she'd said, there were things hidden in plain sight. The report mentioned a military operation, a covert mission that had taken place during his deployment in the late 90s. A mission that, on paper, looked successful. The operation had been deemed necessary by higher-ups, part of the standard strategy to maintain control in a war-torn region. But the deeper I dug into the details, the more it didn't make sense. It was glossed over in the official records. No concrete details about what happened, just vague references to unintended casualties. Casualties that were civilians, not combatants, entire families wiped out in a foreign land, their deaths swept under the rug with a few simple lines of government speak. The investigator had dug up old testimonies, soldiers who had been involved in the operation, a few anonymous letters smuggled out of the war zone and published in a small independent journal. These detailed a cover-up. According to these accounts, the operation had gone horribly wrong. An airstrike that had been called in too hastily, a group of civilians caught in the crossfire. The deaths weren't unintended at all. They were the result of poor decisions made by someone in charge, someone like General Thompson. The report suggested that Thompson, despite being in charge of the operation, had never been held accountable. Instead, the narrative was carefully spun to ensure his reputation remained intact. The survivors of the attack, they said, were quietly silenced. Witnesses who tried to speak out were ignored, their stories erased from history. It was a cover-up, pure and simple. I sat back, my heart pounding in my chest. The man who had always been portrayed as a hero, the rock of this family, had a past drenched in blood. I had always known there was something off about him, something that didn't match the image. But this was far worse than I had ever imagined. This was the dark truth that everyone had either forgotten or been too afraid to acknowledge. But it didn't stop there. The more I read, the more it became clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern. The investigator had found links to other military operations, ones that had similar signs of cover-ups and mismanagement. My mind raced. What kind of man had I really married? I felt a cold anger growing inside me, not just at him, but at everyone who had allowed this to go on. At the family that worshipped him as a hero, without questioning the real cost of that heroism. I had always felt like an outsider in this family, but now I realized I had been blind. I wasn't just an outsider. I had been a victim of their blind loyalty, of their collective silence. The investigator promised to dig deeper, but already a story was unfolding, one I had never expected to find. I was beginning to uncover pieces of a man who was nothing like the image he had crafted for himself. And the more I learned, the more determined I became to bring the truth to light. The phone call from the investigator hit me harder than I expected. Her voice, usually professional, now carried an undertone of something else. Concern, perhaps, or caution. She explained that she had uncovered new documents that would add weight to the reports she'd already sent me. I could feel the tension building as she spoke, every word tightening the knot in my chest. I wasn't ready for what she was about to tell me. The general's past, once carefully shielded, was now beginning to unravel. It wasn't just some forgotten mistake. It was a deliberate cover-up, one that had been orchestrated by high-ranking officials who saw fit to protect their own, no matter the cost. I could hear the rustling of paper on her end as she began to describe the operation, each detail hitting harder than the last. It wasn't just about a failed mission or some minor error in judgment. This was much more. The operation, which took place in a war-torn country overseas, had been a disastrous attempt to secure a strategic location. It was supposed to be a quick operation, low risk, high reward. In reality, it had been anything but. The mission was supposed to neutralize enemy forces, but instead, Innocent civilians were caught in the crossfire. Families, children, lives torn apart by a decision that should never have been made. The orders had been clear. Secure the area at all costs. General Thompson had followed those orders without question, without hesitation. The aftermath of that mission was a mess. The public record was scrubbed clean. The civilian deaths reduced to footnotes in official military reports. But the whispers, those whispers, the ones I had overheard in hushed tones, were more than just rumours. They were true. A few brave souls had tried to speak up, but their voices were drowned out. What could a few soldiers do when the entire machinery of the military-industrial complex was pushing the story in another direction? The civilians, their grief and suffering meant nothing when weighed against national interests. The investigator's voice dropped as she went on, revealing even more. She told me about the government's response to the scandal. The families of the dead civilians had been silenced, offered compensation that couldn't begin to ease their pain. But that was only part of the story. Those who had survived, those who had lost everything, were given little to no support. And those who spoke out against the operation were either ignored or, worse, discredited. The military had its way of sweeping these things under the rug. General Thompson had been one of the officers responsible for executing that operation, and despite the lives lost, despite the terrible consequences, he had been protected. His reputation remained intact. He was promoted, lauded as a hero for his bravery and leadership. But behind closed doors, he knew the truth. He knew what he had done, and so did the government. They had all been complicit in silencing the truth. The very thing he had built his career on was built on the blood of innocence. My hands were trembling as I listened. I thought about the stories I had heard growing up, about heroes, real heroes, who fought for freedom and justice. That was what my husband had always believed about his father. But now, the man I thought I knew was nothing like the hero I had imagined. What everyone in the family had believed, the stories we had all been told, fed to us like some sanitized version of history, had all been lies. The general wasn't a hero. He was a man who had made a decision that cost lives and never had to face the consequences. The investigator paused before continuing. She explained that some of the soldiers who had participated in the operation were still alive, some of them even haunted by the events of that day. They had lived with the guilt of taking innocent lives, but more than that, they had been left to carry the burden of a decision they had been forced to follow. They had lived with the truth, while the general had gone on to bigger and better things, his name untouched by scandal. Her words were like shards of glass, cutting through me. I hadn't known the full extent of what had happened, what my father-in-law had been a part of. I had always known that something wasn't right, but now the reality of it was so much darker than I had ever imagined. The man I had tried to respect, the man I had tried to understand, had played a direct role in this tragedy. His actions had not only ruined the lives of innocent people abroad, but had also created a ripple effect that reached into my own life. I put the phone down, my heart hammering in my chest. The truth, raw and unforgiving, was now staring me in the face. I could hardly breathe. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it all. How could I have been so blind? For years I had watched my husband idolize his father, bask in the light of his accomplishments, but now I was beginning to see the cracks in the facade. I wanted to scream, to tell everyone the truth, to expose him for the man he really was. But something inside me hesitated. If I spoke out, if I shared what I had learned, it wouldn't just be the general who would suffer. He would be my family, my husband, the man I loved. What would this revelation do to our lives? What would it do to the family I had tried so hard to belong to? I felt a sense of betrayal so deep that it nearly consumed me, not just by my father-in-law, but by everyone who had let this go on. My husband, who had always been so loyal to his father, would have to live with the knowledge of what his hero had done. Could he ever look at him the same way again? Would he believe me? Or would he think I was simply trying to destroy the reputation of the man who had shaped his life? I thought about the families who had suffered, the lives that had been lost, and the lies that had been built around the truth. I thought about the innocent civilians who had been nothing more than collateral damage in a war that had never been theirs to fight. And I thought about the people who had tried to make it right, but had been silenced, dismissed as liars or troublemakers. But then something inside me hardened. I couldn't keep this secret. I couldn't live with the weight of knowing the truth and doing nothing. I wasn't just going to stand by and allow him to continue living this lie. He had destroyed lives, and now it was time for the truth to come out. I knew what I had to do, but the question remained: how? How could I expose him without destroying everything else in the process? It wasn't just a matter of right or wrong anymore, it was a matter of what I was willing to lose in the pursuit of justice. Could I bring myself to do it? Could I take this step, knowing the cost? The decision loomed large in my mind, each second stretching longer than the last. A week had passed since I'd first learned the truth. A week of sleepless nights, of pacing through my house with the weight of the knowledge I'd uncovered pressing on me like an anchor. Each day felt like an eternity, and each time I looked at my husband, I wondered how much longer I could keep the secret. My father-in-law's image had shattered in my mind, and yet I found myself wondering, was this really the right thing to do? Was it worth it? I knew I had to confront him. The lie he'd built his life on needed to be exposed, even if it meant tearing apart the family he had so carefully crafted. But the thought of facing him, of calling out the man who had always been so coldly authoritative yet so revered, was terrifying. I hadn't prepared for this moment. I hadn't truly considered how much it would hurt, how much it would cost me. I called him on the morning of the confrontation, my voice steady as I spoke despite the tumult inside me. "I need to talk to you about something," I said. "It's about a family matter. Can you come over later?" His voice was calm as usual, but there was a subtle edge to it, as if he sensed something. "Of course, I'll be there at 3. When the doorbell rang that afternoon, my heart skipped a beat. I hadn't realized how much anxiety I'd been carrying until the moment I saw him standing there, just like every other time. Tall, imposing, dressed in his military uniform as if he had never fully left the army. The door creaked open, and I felt a shiver run through me. "Come in, General," I said, trying to mask the coldness in my voice with forced politeness. He stepped into the house, glancing around as if everything were perfectly normal. "What's this about, then?" he asked, a faint hint of amusement in his tone. I led him into the living room where I had already set the stage, a low table between us, a chair for him, and my seat across from him. Everything felt too perfect, too rehearsed. I almost felt like an actor about to perform a scene I could not escape. "Please sit," I said, gesturing toward the chair. I couldn't look him in the eye. Not yet. I had to control my breath, my heartbeat. It wasn't just the confrontation I feared. It was the truth that would change everything. He settled into the chair, his posture straight, his gaze steady. He looked at me as if waiting for some trivial conversation, but I wasn't sure I could pretend any longer. "You've built an image for yourself over the years," I started, my voice firmer now. "A reputation as a hero. But what if that reputation is built on lies?" His face didn't change, but his jaw tightened just a fraction. I could see it, the mask slipping ever so slightly. He knew something was wrong. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said smoothly, his voice unwavering. "I'm talking about your military service," I pressed. "I'm talking about the operation that changed everything, the one that you've managed to hide for so long." His eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. He hadn't even flinched. The silence between us felt like it stretched for an eternity. And in that moment, I knew the truth was something he'd been running from for years. I reached into my bag and pulled out the stack of papers, the investigators' findings, the reports, the evidence. Everything I had learned was here in black and white. No more speculation, no more half-truths, just the facts. I laid them on the table between us. Here it is, I said, my voice unshakable. The truth. The operation in that foreign country. The civilians who died. You were there. You were in charge. His eyes flicked to the papers, but he didn't touch them. This is nonsense. These are fabrications designed to ruin my name, he growled. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. It's not a lie. I've spoken to the soldiers who were there. I've seen the records. And you knew what happened, didn't you? You knew the civilian casualties were swept under the rug and you didn't speak up. You let innocent people suffer. He stiffened in his chair, the colour draining from his face. For a moment he looked vulnerable, unsure, like a man who had been caught, exposed, but only for a moment. This is an attack on my honour, he growled, his voice rising. I served this country with distinction. I was protecting our interests, making sure this country remained safe. And you have the audacity to accuse me of murder. It's not about protecting this country, I replied. It's about what happened to those people. My voice grew louder. Their lives were destroyed because of an order you gave, and now you sit here acting as if nothing ever happened. His eyes hardened. The calm demeanour he had worn for so many years was gone, replaced with a cold fury that I had never seen before. You don't know what you're talking about, he spat. You think you can tear down everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed? You think you can just— I don't want to tear you down, I interrupted, my voice steady but forceful. I want the truth to come out. I want you to be held accountable for what happened. It's not about you anymore, it's about what's right. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. You have no idea what you're doing. This is not your battle to fight. This is a matter of national security, of duty and honour. You think I haven't paid the price for those decisions? I didn't flinch. I didn't back down. You made your choice. You chose to cover it up. You chose to protect your own reputation over the truth, and now you'll pay the price. His face twisted in anger, his voice thick with disdain. You'll regret this. You'll regret ever questioning me. I stood as well, walking slowly toward him, the intensity in the air so thick I could hardly breathe. I'll never regret standing up for what's right. Not when it means exposing a man who thought he was above the law, above the truth. You're not untouchable, General. He stood there frozen, his eyes burning with fury. For a moment, I saw the man I had feared all these years, the man who would stop at nothing to protect his own legacy. But now I saw him for what he really was, a man who had been hiding behind a mask, running from his own actions. You think this is over? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. You think this will be the end of it? I have the power to bury you, to destroy everything you've worked for. Don't think for a second that you're safe. I didn't flinch. I've already made my peace with whatever happens next. But you, your reputation, your life, it's not going to stay intact, not after what you've done. He turned and stormed out of the room, leaving me alone in the silence of the aftermath. The truth was now out there. There was no going back. But as I watched him leave, I knew this confrontation was only the beginning. The truth would come to light, no matter what. And I would make sure of it. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken words and the force of emotions that had been brewing for far too long. I stood there, my chest rising and falling with each breath, my body still trembling from the confrontation. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I had expected resistance, of course. I had expected him to deny it, to try and bury the truth with his usual charm, his calculated calm. But what I hadn't expected was the fury, the rage that bubbled up from deep inside him. A side of the general I had never seen before. It was raw, uncontrollable, like a man who had spent his life hiding behind a shield of authority and military discipline, only to have it shattered in an instant. He stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw so tight I thought it might break. For a brief moment, I wondered if he was going to lunge at me physically, try to silence me. But instead, he took a deep breath, and in a voice that was deceptively calm, he said, "You don't understand, do you?" I met his gaze, standing tall despite the terror I felt creeping up my spine. "I understand enough to know that what you did was wrong. You took innocent lives and you covered it up. You don't get to hide behind that military duty nonsense anymore." His eyes narrowed, and for a second, I thought he might laugh. But then he spoke again, his voice low, venomous. "You think this is about duty? You think this is about protecting people? It's more than that. It's about sacrifice. It's about doing what no one else is willing to do. You, with your soft little life, couldn't possibly understand what it's like to make those kinds of decisions, to carry that burden. I did what I had to do to protect this country, and I don't expect a pampered civilian like you to appreciate it." I felt my blood boil at his words. Pampered? You're calling me pampered? You think I've lived an easy life? You think I don't know about sacrifice? Maybe I didn't fight in a war, but I've been fighting for my place in this family, fighting to be seen as something more than just your daughter-in-law. You've never given me an ounce of respect, and now you're using your military duty to justify murder. His eyes flashed, and I saw something dark, something ugly. "I didn't murder anyone," he snarled. "I made tough choices, and if you can't see that, then you're just another soft civilian who doesn't get it. You've never been in the field. You've never had to make a call that could cost lives." "I don't need to have been in the field to know what's right and wrong," I shot back, my voice rising in defiance. "You think because you wore a uniform that gives you a free pass to do whatever you want, to take lives without consequence? Well, I'm done letting you hide behind that excuse." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, and just as I thought the tension might snap, the door opened. My husband stepped into the room, his face pale, eyes wide with shock. He had heard the argument from the other room, no doubt, and now he was in the middle of it, unable to ignore it any longer. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the betrayal of seeing his father in such a vulnerable, angry state. He had always been so blind to what was happening under the surface, so eager to protect the family from anything that threatened the image they'd built. I didn't even have to answer. The general, realizing the gravity of the situation, turned his focus to his son. "This is none of your business," he snapped, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't need to get involved in this." But my husband was already walking toward us, his eyes flicking from me to his father, taking in the full scope of the situation. "What's going on?" he asked again, his voice rising now, laced with anger. "What is this about?" I stood up straighter, the words ready to spill out, the truth now at the tip of my tongue. "It's about your father's past, the operation he was involved in that killed innocent people. He's been hiding it for years, and I finally found out the truth." The shock on his face was immediate. His eyes widened, his mouth went dry. "What?" he whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Dad, is this true?" The general turned toward him, a look of utter disbelief crossing his face. "Don't listen to her, son. She's just trying to destroy me. This is all a lie, a smear campaign. You know I've always done what's best for this country." But my husband wasn't having it. "No, Dad. I need to know the truth. Did you kill those people?" The general's face twisted in a way I had never seen before. For a brief moment, I saw the mask slip entirely. The general was no longer the unshakable commander figure who had always seemed so invincible. in that moment he was just a man who had been caught, exposed. The facade cracked. "I did what I had to do," he yelled, slamming his fist down on the table. "I protected this country, protected you. I sacrificed everything for this family, for this country, and you think you can tear me down over one mistake?" I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't the man I had been married to, nor the father-in-law I had grown accustomed to. This was something darker, something that had been hidden behind layers of pride and denial for so long, and it was all coming to the surface. "You can't just destroy him like this," my husband cried, his voice rising in desperation. "You don't know what it's like, you don't understand. He made hard decisions." "No!" I shouted back, my voice raw. "He made selfish decisions, and now those decisions are destroying everything." In that moment, it was as though the room itself was closing in on us. My husband was caught between his loyalty to his father and the truth I had just uncovered. He looked at me, torn, and then at his father, who stood there seething with anger. I saw the pain in his eyes, the shock of being caught between the two most important people in his life. Then, as the tension reached its peak, my father-in-law's voice fell, almost as though he were speaking to himself. "This family will never be the same again," he muttered. It was a statement of defeat, a grim acknowledgement of the truth that had been revealed. But as I stood there, watching everything unravel, something shifted within me. The power I had once felt I had to fight for was now mine. I wasn't the meek outsider anymore, the one who waited for permission to speak. I was the one holding the truth, and that truth had shattered everything. But as the chaos unfolded, I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow this victory had come at a great cost. Was it really worth it in the end? Would I be able to live with the consequences of exposing a man who had built an empire of lies? Or had I lost something too in the process? My mind churned with these questions, but one thing was clear. There was no turning back now. The days after the confrontation were filled with an overwhelming sense of chaos. It felt as though the storm had passed, but the dust still hadn't settled. The general's name had been dragged through the mud, his once glorious reputation shattered. Family members who had once idolized him now whispered behind closed doors, exchanging glances of disbelief mixed with newfound caution. It was as if they had been living in a carefully constructed illusion, which I had just torn apart with one simple act. Apologies came from some corners, though they felt hollow. The ones who had been most vocal in their support, who had rallied behind his military persona, now seemed like shadows of their former selves. Their words felt rehearsed, insincere. I could see through the facade, and it made me question whether any of the relationships I had thought were real had ever been more than just part of the grand illusion we had all maintained. But some family members distanced themselves entirely, choosing to side with the general or perhaps simply avoiding the truth altogether. I wasn't sure which was worse, the coldness from those who had quietly accepted his actions, or the open hostility from those who still clung to their blind loyalty. It wasn't just my father-in-law who was disillusioned. The family had splintered. And in the process, so had my own sense of belonging. It was the distance from my husband that hurt the most. At first, he had tried to stay neutral, unsure of how to process what I had revealed. But as the days wore on, I saw the subtle shifts in his behavior, the tension in his shoulders when he came home, the way his eyes darted away from mine when we spoke. It was as if the very foundation of our marriage had cracked under the weight of the secret I had unearthed. He was angry with me. Not just angry, but disappointed and hurt. I could see it in the way he looked at me, a kind of resentment that hadn't been there before. I had always known there were things about him I would never fully understand. Things buried in the past that even his closest friends and family would never dare to speak of. But now, The distance between us had become a chasm. He couldn't reconcile the man he thought his father was with the truth I had exposed. And I couldn't reconcile the man I had married with the one who would defend a man like his father. The late-night conversations turned into stilted, tense silences. The questions I had hoped he would ask me, the understanding I needed from him, never came. Instead, we sat in rooms that felt too large, too empty. Our words were mere formalities. He didn't understand my need to act, nor did he seem to care anymore. And that was the hardest part because I hadn't done this for anyone else. I hadn't done it for revenge or for the sense of triumph that might come with exposing someone's darkest secret. I had done it for me, and somewhere along the way, I had lost him in the process. In the stillness of my own thoughts, I began to wonder if it had all been worth it. What had I really gained? The general was tarnished, yes, but so was I. What had been the point of dragging all of this to the surface, only to find myself standing amidst the wreckage? Had I truly won? Or had I simply become another pawn in a much larger game, one filled with power plays, manipulation, and consequences I hadn't fully grasped at the time? At one point, I found myself wandering through the house, my footsteps muffled on the wooden floors, unsure of where I belonged anymore. The walls that had once felt like a home now seemed to close in on me, suffocating me with their memories. The pictures on the mantel, the heirlooms passed down through generations, all of it felt like an anchor, pulling me deeper into a world I no longer fit into. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with whispers of who I was supposed to be, who I was expected to become. But who had I become in all of this? And then, one evening, while I sat alone on the porch watching the sun set in a violent burst of orange and pink, something shifted. It wasn't a grand realization, but a quiet, almost imperceptible change in my perspective. I didn't need anyone's approval. I didn't need the apology of my husband or the validation of the family. I didn't need to fit into their mold anymore. What I had gained was far more valuable than the destruction of my father-in-law's reputation. It was the understanding that I could stand on my own, not as a victim, but as someone who had finally taken control of her own narrative. I didn't need their acceptance. I never had. The strength I had thought I would find in revenge, in exposing the lies, had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of fear and doubt. I had been afraid of what would happen if I spoke up, if I revealed the ugly truths that had been buried in the corners of my world. But in that moment, as the evening light began to fade, I realized that the power I had been searching for wasn't in the destruction of another person. It was in the ability to speak my truth and stand by it regardless of the consequences. As I stood there, the wind brushing against my face, a sense of peace washed over me. The world was still chaotic, the family still divided, and my relationship with my husband was hanging by a thread. But I no longer felt the need to fix it all. I had done what I needed to do. I had faced the truth, and in doing so, I had found something I never expected: myself. The days that followed weren't perfect, and I didn't expect them to be. There were still arguments, still moments where the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. But I no longer felt lost in the turmoil. I no longer felt like I had to be someone else to fit in, to be accepted. I had walked away from the toxic expectations that had plagued me for years, and in doing so, I had become something stronger, something more authentic. I had never been someone who wore their anger as a badge of honor. Revenge wasn't what had driven me. It was the quiet, subtle force of self-respect, the refusal to stay silent and shrink into the shadows. I wasn't the meek outsider anymore. I was someone who had chosen her own path, and no one could take that away from me. Walking away from the family wasn't easy. It wasn't the happy ending I had imagined when I first uncovered the truth, but it was mine. And in that, I had found a freedom that no one could ever take from me. The family, the general, my husband. None of them could define who I was anymore. That was my choice, and in the end, that was the most powerful thing of all.